want you to imagine that you're on a dive. You look over to your dive buddy and you realize he's giving you a signal that no diver ever wants to see. He's giving you the out of air signal. You suddenly realize that you're going to need to share air with your dive buddy. Now, if you're wearing a gear configuration like I am, you're of course going to reach down, grab your Octopus and hand that to your dive buddy. But what about all the other types of gear configurations? If you've been around for any amount of time in diving, you've probably realized that there's many different ways of setting up your primary and your second stage and your gear in general in order to share air. In this video, we're going to talk about the different types of gear configurations and the pros and cons of each that'll help you to decide which configuration is going to be best for you. Now, before we get started, make sure you give us a thumbs up. And also, if you haven't already done so, make sure you subscribe to our channel so you can see more videos like this one. Now, before we continue, it's really important for me to stress the fact that this video is not meant to replace scuba instruction. We're merely talking about the different ways of sharing air with different configurations, but that sharing of the air is something that you absolutely need to learn under the supervision of a qualified scuba instructor. All right, I want to start out by talking about the most common type of gear configuration that probably exists in the scuba market out there, and that's this one right here. I'm wearing a jacket style BCD, and I have my Octo connected to an Octo holder. Now, the main benefit, that's probably the reason why this is one of the most common types of gear configurations, the main benefit to this is the fact that I am going to be breathing off of my primary air source, and if my dive buddy is short on air, running out of air, and I need to share air with them, I am never going to need to take this regulator out of my mouth. I'm going to be able to hand off this Octopus in order for them to breathe from it. So that's really the primary thing. It's one of the philosophical differences when it comes to sharing air. With all the other gear configurations in a moment you're going to see, I have to actually hand off that primary air source. So some instructors don't like the idea that the diver is going to have to take their primary air source out of their mouths. Other ones are fine with it. I just want to explain what the different differences are. Now, the other benefit to this type of gear configuration is the fact that because this is on a big bright yellow hose and I never need to take my primary air source out, another diver can come and they can grab this yellow hose even if I'm not paying attention. So if I wasn't noticing that the diver's giving me the out of air signal and they come and they grab this, they can initiate the air sharing process without my active participation. So that's the other benefit to this type of gear configuration. So let's talk about some of the negatives that deal with this particular type of gear configuration. And some of the main negatives of this configuration really center around the Octopus holder. And let me explain what I mean by that. You see, the Octopus holder has a dual purpose, and those two purposes actually conflict with each other. So first of all, the Octopus holder obviously has to hold the Octopus securely in place at all times so that this doesn't become dislodged accidentally. Now, the Octopus holder also needs to be very easy to be able to release so that if a dive buddy needs this and they pull on it, it's obviously going to have to be able to detach very easily and very quickly. And that's the problem, is all too often these Octo holders don't do both jobs properly. And then what ends up happening is that if this isn't holding properly, you've probably seen it before on dives where somebody's just diving and they're completely oblivious to the fact that this Octo is just dangling all over the place. Now, if the Octopus is dangling, now that creates new problems. First problem is if you do have to share air and this is dangling somewhere behind you, now you need to go fishing for your Octo before you can even hand it off, or your dive buddy has to go trying to find something that's dangling all over the place. So that's really a bad thing. Secondly, we all want to be conscientious divers and we don't want to be beating up the reef. And obviously if this is dangling around all over the place, not only is it an entanglement hazard for you as a diver, but it's also going to be beating up the reefs, and that's something that's becoming a bigger and bigger concern every day, that our reefs are getting damaged, especially by divers, and that's something that should never ever happen. Now, the third thing that could happen, which is a bad thing if this thing starts to dangle, is that if your Octo starts to leak air, if you start having a gas leak coming through here and it's somewhere behind you, you're not even going to know about it. So that's really the reason why a lot of people don't like this type of gear configuration, is because all too often this thing starts to dangle. Now, the other thing that should be mentioned, and obviously this is something that can be corrected for, is that all too often, because most of the time the divers aren't using this Octopus, a lot of times this Octopus is a lower performing regulator. And if it's a lower performing regulator, you got to remember the person who's coming up to you that's needing to share air, and that moment oftentimes is going to be over breathing the regulator. They're going to be very stressed out, and you don't want to necessarily hand out a regulator that's not a high performing regulator. Now, obviously you can compensate for that by making sure that this is a higher performing regulator, but it's all too often in this industry that we see that this regulator is not a high performing reg. I've gone ahead and I've switched my rig out because I want to talk about some of the pros and cons of having a different type of gear configuration. Now with this particular rig, you're going to notice that I'm using what's known as an Air 2, and there's different names for this, but the whole idea is that I've combined my inflator together with a regulator. And with this type of gear configuration, this is where I'm going to be breathing off of my primary air source. However, if my dive buddy is out of air, I'm going to have to go ahead and give them my primary air source, and I'm going to switch over to this Air 2. So that's just so you understand what the main difference is with this type of a configuration. Now let's talk about some of the pros and the cons. So let's talk about some of the pros of this type of a gear setup. Now the first pro of using this type of a gear setup is that everything is streamlined. And because we've gotten rid of the octo holder, which is the point of failure with the other type of setup we talked about a moment ago, and we've actually combined our alternate air source together with our octo, we no longer have to worry about the octo dangling behind us, beating up the reef, or being hard to find when we actually need it. So that's the first reason why a lot of people gravitate towards this. It's just the fact that everything is nice and tight and it's streamlined near you. Now, the other thing is, because I'm going to be giving away my primary air source, and again, this is a major philosophical difference between some instructors, but because I'm giving away my primary air source, I'm always giving away an air source that I know is working, is high performing. I mean, I just had it in my mouth a minute ago, I was breathing from it. So if that diver that's coming towards me is panicked, I'm giving them something which I know is working really well at that moment. Now, the next thing is, and this is again, one of the philosophical differences, is that because I need to give away this primary air source, it also puts me in control. So I need to initiate giving this alternate air source. I need to grab the diver and be in control of the situation. So to me, this is a pro because it puts me in control, and it means the diver can't just randomly grab one of the hoses away from me and start doing alternate air source breathing without me being in control. Now, the last thing, and this is something that a lot of people don't want to talk about, is that a lot of times when somebody is running low on air or they're out of air, they're in a panicked situation. And all too often, and this is something nobody wants to talk about, is when somebody is panicking and they're really in that fight or flight mode where they think that they're going to die, in that moment, they'll grab anything that is going to give them air. And all too often, what that means is I'm just diving along and they're going to come and they're going to rip this regulator out to be able to start breathing from it and initiate it on their own. So if that happens and they rip this regulator out to start to breathe, no problem. I just go over to my alternate air source, start breathing from it, and then I resume, and obviously I take control of this situation at this point, and I bring them up to the surface. So that's really the four main benefits of this type of gear configuration. So now that we talked about some of the pros, let's talk about some of the negatives of this particular configuration. Now, the first negative is that, as I mentioned before, it requires me to be actively participating. So if my buddy's out of air, I'm the one that needs to initiate, give away this primary air source, and switch to my alternate air source over here. So they can't just come and grab a regulator from me and start breathing. So it requires the diver that's doing the air sharing to be more skilled, and that's one of the major philosophical differences. Some instructors prefer for a diver to just be able to come and grab the octo. I personally prefer it this way because I want to be in control and I want to be actively participating. Now, the next bad thing or negative about this particular configuration is that because this alternate air source is on a really, really short hose, again, somebody can't just come and grab it. They technically probably could, but they're going to be right up on you. So most of the time, you're going to be the one needing to initiate, needing to give away that primary air source. And then the last con to this type of gear configuration is that because we're combining the regulator together with the low pressure inflator, a lot of times if this regulator is not well maintained, well serviced, this tends to be a lower performing regulator than you could have otherwise if you had two high performing regulators as a primary and an Octopus. So those are really the cons to this type of a gear configuration. So I've gone ahead and I've switched into my final gear configuration, which is a backplane wing. And this is what a lot of people consider to be a technical setup. But even though its origins are in technical diving, it really doesn't have to be at all technical. This can be used perfectly fine for recreational diving. Now, the big difference with this particular configuration is that you can see I have my alternate air source on a necklace instead of having that combination where I had a moment ago with my inflator and my octo being all in one place. And then this hose in this configuration a lot of times tends to be a longer hose. So you can see this is a 7-foot hose, but it can be a 5-foot hose. But the reality is that if you're diving open water, you don't need this to be necessarily a long hose. I only dive a long hose because I do dive technical and I like to have the same configuration throughout every time I go diving. Now, just for background, this particular configuration, origins come from cave diving. It's named a Hogarthian setup, and it's named after a man named Bill Hogarth, Maine, who was a cave explorer who basically put this type of configuration together first. So let's talk about some of the benefits of using a rig like this. First of all, a rig like this is streamlined. Again, I don't have any of the problems of having an Octo that can dangle behind me, get beat up the reef, become entangled, or start leaking and me not noticing it. So I've eliminated that problem completely. Everything is streamlined and tight close to me. The other thing is, a rig like this puts me in control. Again, this is a philosophical difference between some instructors, but with this particular setup, I always have to give away my primary air source and then go to my secondary. So what that means is I'm the person who's in control of the situation at all times. And then because I have two secondary second stages, the one on my necklace and the one that I give away, most of the times, again, this can be compensated for, but most of the time, both regulators are going to be high performing. So when I give this away and I go to this regulator, I'm not even going to notice a difference most of the time switching from one to the other. And then finally, because the Octo is on a necklace, what it means is it can't get lost. It can't go anywhere. So I can't have it dangling, I can't have it go anywhere. And if somebody were to rip this out of my mouth or this were to fall out of my mouth for any reason, I always know right where my Octopus is at. Now let's talk about some of the negatives of using a gear configuration like this one. Now the first negative, and this of course doesn't have to be the case, but if you do dive with a 5 or a 7-foot hose, is that when you're on the surface, a gear configuration like this, the regulator can dangle when you're on the surface, and it can damage the second stage on here. So you have to take a lot of care when you're on the surface to make sure that you clip it off and you never let it dangle. Now in the water, it's never an issue because of the fact that it is inside your mouth. So it's never gonna dangle when you're in the water. The other potential negative, and again, this is a philosophical difference between some instructors, is the fact that if a diver is out of air, they can't just come up to me and grab their own air to start breathing. I have to actively give them the air source that they're gonna breathe from. So they can't grab the secondary because this is pretty much tied down on the necklace and this is what I'm breathing from unless they rip it out of my mouth. So that's the other thing, that it's a philosophical difference, but you cannot just come up to a diver who's diving this configuration and start alternate air source breathing without the active participation of the diver that's using this configuration. So now you've seen the 3 major ways of sharing air and the gear configurations that are used in order to do so. Now it's really important for you to understand that no matter what gear configuration you choose, you need to get in the water with a qualified scuba instructor and learn and practice how to share air using that configuration so that you're ready the moment that you need it. And number 2, it's really important that whatever gear configuration you're using, that you communicate it during the buddy check before the dive so that both you and your buddy know what kind of gear configuration you're using and you know what kind of gear configuration your buddy is using before you get into the water. Now, if you enjoyed this video, make sure you give it a thumbs up and make sure you subscribe to our channel. Also, if you found the information in this video useful, you're definitely going to enjoy our free guide, The 4 Keys to Mastering Your Diving. In it, we go into 4 specific keys that are going to help you to stay down longer, consume less gas, and really get a lot more enjoyment out of every dive that you do. You'll be able to download that guide by clicking on a link somewhere in the description, or also on the little book itself, or the eye over on the top right corner. Go to any one of those and you'll be able to download your free guide. I want to thank you for watching this video, and I'll see you in the water.